Well, welcome back to Mr. Obsolete's Vintage Homesteading. If you're looking for our video from last week, we didn't have one. We had some technical difficulties and we're not able to rectify them before the time ran out to post it. So anyway, here we are. And what we're going to be talking about today is Bolens chainsaws and how they came about. And so we're going to be talking about several companies that were indirectly or directly responsible for them. So Bolens was a company that started making hand tools for farming and whatnot like that in 1850. They were the first company to have a gas-powered tiller in 1919. And they also branched out into lawn mowing and yard maintenance equipment. So anyway, FMC, which is Food, Machine and Chemical Company, bought Bolens in 1946. After World War II, there was a pent-up demand for yard equipment and small farm equipment, so they wanted to cash in on the market. And by 1952, the chainsaw market was really expanding, and they decided to get into selling chainsaws. So anyway, this model here is a later one, but I always thought that they made their own saws. That was not true, and I fortunately just found some really good vintage BS on them. So anyway, 1952 is the first year they sold chainsaws. And the saws they sold were made by Clinton. And so anyway, Clinton was another small engine company that started in 1946, making small industrial and gas engines for tillage equipment and everything else. Got into the chainsaw business pretty early, and eventually outboard motors also. So this would be basically one of the first models that Bolens sold. It's a Clinton Model 3A. It's a 74cc. It's rated at 3.5 horsepower. And like most early saws, it has a gear reduction system on it, because the engine speeds were low back then, usually between 4,000 and 5,000 RPM, and so and low horsepower too, is 3.5 horse. And they had these big chains on them, so what they would do is give it a gear reduction so it had a mechanical advantage to run a big chain. The thing that's unusual about this one is that it has a belt drive, a Gilmer belt, which is a toothed rubber belt, just like they use on timing belts on cars today. And so the good thing on that was that the engine runs the same direction that the chain. Like a lot of the early saws with the actual gear reduction, the motors were run backwards so that the chain would move the proper direction. So this has some unique features, and we'll just talk a little bit about the features, good and bad, that the early saws have, and that's part of collecting them, as the interesting things that they tried, because there was nothing to copy. So they just came up with their own stuff. Some good, some bad. So this one doesn't have a pumper carburetor. It has a float valve carburetor. And so it can't run on its side or upside down or anything like that. And so different saw manufacturers tried different ideas, and this one is kind of one of the weird ones, because the carburetor's under here, sits vertical, and then the fuel runs down. So if you want to do a side cut, you rotate the power head so the carburetor is still sitting upright. Big heavy saw like this is pretty cumbersome. So anyway, the Clinton saws were sold through 54 by Bolens, and possibly into early 1955. And so another saw that was indirectly connected to the Bolens era. This is a Titan chainsaw made in Seattle, Washington. They started making saws prior to World War II, and they were two-man saws. And they could see the market changing after the war, World War II, and wanted to make smaller saws. Now the saws they did early on were all commercial saws like this one. They started making them smaller, but they had to couple of drawbacks. One of them, the first one-man saw they made, a Model 30, had a lot of problems, overheated and was underpowered and stuff, and gave them a black eye, even though they had a pretty good share of the market at the time. And so they re-engineered it and came out with this, the Model 40, and the problems were solved. But they were, other thing that was not really a problem, but it was cost-wise is that everything on these is sand cast, because the company that made Titans is Mine and Mill Company. You know, they did lots of castings for all kinds of industrial and mining equipment and whatnot like that, and they're really good. The drawback is it's quite heavy. So, well, on the Titans here, they did Clinton a better job on it. Went up to them. This one, there again, float feed carb. If you want to do a side cut on this saw, you flip this lever. And you rotate the bar here. It's pretty stiff, but anyway, you can get it so it's that direction there. And hopefully this saw will be a project I'll get done this winter. But anyway, that's one of the things there again, all the interesting features, good and bad, that the early saws had. Makes it a fascinating hobby. So anyway, they'd lost a lot of market share and causing a lot of financial problems in the company, and so in 1955 they sold out the saw division. But all the saws that they produced were based on this same design here, except for one. And this was an expensive saw to make, and so before they sold out in 1955 they decided to try marketing a farm saw that they didn't manufacture the whole saw. And here it is. This is a Titan Model 30, and this was introduced in 1954. And so prior to this saw being on the market, the Titan chainsaws, other than ignition and carburetor, like bearings and a few things like that, everything on the saw was in-house. They made their own chain, their own bars, the power head, everything except for just a few items. So this saw was less expensive to make. And one of the reasons they bought a engine that they didn't make, and this is a West Bend engine. And so it has a couple of interesting features there. Again, everyone was trying a lot of different things. Now this one has a Tillotson Model H carburetor, and it was the first carburetor that would pump fuel out instead of just float feed carburetor letting gravity run the fuel in. But it didn't pump the fuel, so what this one did, it had a gravity feed fuel, and then it would pressurize the fuel tank and that would run back to the carburetor. So that was a really an unusual feature, and I think this is the only saw basically that I know of that ever did that. So anyway, chains were getting smaller. This is also not a gear reduction saw, it's direct drive. It has straight exhaust, blow your eardrums off. So anyway, when Draper bought it in 1955, they continued making the Titan chainsaws, and they sold out in 1957 to a different company, and they kept the bars and the chain division, and they sold it to Propulsion Engine Company. So from 1957 on, like I say, the Bolens saws were made by Propulsion Engine Company, and I think one of the reasons they probably didn't survive, last I can find of them, is the early 60s, that had a lot of really nice expensive castings on most of their saws, and they're expensive to produce, and they did not make their own engines either. So, and then the bars and the chains were made from the former Titan company that Draper bought, and they kept the bar and chain division. So anyway, that kind of gives you how they started. So they started with the Titan, moving into the homeowner saw, Draper Engineering buying them, and then eventually FMC owning them, Propulsion Engine Company. So I'm not sure if the Propulsion Engine Company was purchased by FMC or not. I can't find that information, but I'm guessing it might be that they were a division of Bolens. So anyway, there's not a whole lot of history out there on these things, so I was really happy to find out what I could. Well, I just wanted to talk briefly about why I think that Bolens failed in the chainsaw market. I think the number one reason was they're expensive to produce because they had a lot nicer features on them than a lot of other low-end saws. But I think the one that really did them in is they tried to get into the commercial saw market, like with this here. You know, this is the biggest model they made. It's got a 37-inch bar on it. And it's only rated at 4 horsepower at 4,000 RPM. Now it is a gear reduction saw, but I think compared to the McCullochs and the Homelights and the IEL Pioneers of the same era, they were a lot more powerful and easier to find, because you know, with these they had the parts, you know, from the dealer would be for the main saw, and then the engine you had to go to a separate place to get engine parts generally. So, and the McCullochs and the Homelights and all that were all made in-house. So anyway, there's my take on why they went. Well, for the last part of the video, we're going to be talking about chainsaw bars and a few other things. So anyway, Mr. Cheesy here, or 034, needed a new bar and chain when I received it, and so anyway, my other stills, the small ones anyway, have original Rollomatic still bars on them, which are nice bars, good bars. And this had a 20-inch on it originally, and so I was looking around for another 20-inch Rollomatic bar, but they were all had stupid still prices on them. They're too expensive for what they are. So anyway, I was able to get this 24-inch Sumara bar for $30 less than I could buy a 20-inch still. So anyway, I wanted to talk just briefly about the bars that I've used in the past, since most of my saws that I used for firewood cutting for years were all McCullochs. And the bars that were on the McCullochs were made by Windsor, which has been out of business for a long time. And I never really had to replace the bars on them very often because those things wear forever. And of course the McCullochs have an overriding oil button on them, so you can put lots of oil on the bar in a hard cut or a dirty cut. But anyway, they're not easy to find anymore. And so I've put some Oregon bars on some of my saws, and a lot of the older saws that I have that are not McCullochs have Oregon bars on them. But anyway, I looked on some arborist sites to see what they thought about the different brands, and almost universally they said the best bar out there are Canons, and they're a really expensive professional grade bar. And the interesting thing after that, they said that the Japanese bars, the Tsujihara and the Sumura, were probably the best other ones that were not the really expensive high-end bars on them. So anyway, and a couple of the sites talked about the different brands and where they would put them. And so, like I say, there were the Canons, the Tsujihara, and the Sumura were about the same, and they were like in second. And third was Still, and fourth was Oregon, and after that's kind of the Brand X Chinese ones, Holzform, and some of the other stuff. But the thing I found with Oregon stuff is that the newer the stuff is, it's hit and miss about good quality. And so I put a 20-inch bar on one of my McCulloch 610s, an Oregon bar, and it lasted for a really long time. But as it wore out and I had to grind down the rails on it, the rails would wear faster and faster every time, and the last time I ground them down, it was like peanut butter. It just wouldn't stay good for nothing. So I had to throw that bar away and put a better bar on it again. But anyway, so it'd be interesting to hear what you, the viewers, have to say about the Japanese bars compared to the others, and what your experiences have been with them. And like I say, one thing on the Oregon stuff, like I was talking about again, is you either get really good stuff or sometimes marginal stuff. And they're homeowner grade bars and stuff, apparently they're starting to make them in China, which is bad. And I've almost always used Oregon chain, the 3/8 stuff that I have. I inherited almost a full roll of it many years ago. still have some of it left, but 3/8 low profile I have to buy out, and so I went to the local dealer and bought a 3/8 LP chain for it, and it's really peanut butter. It's cheesy. It's not very good. It's really soft. It doesn't hold an edge very good, and so I was doing a little research on Oregon and on their chain. I usually make it in Oregon, or a lot of it made up in Canada these days, and have a plant in Brazil and one in China. And there several posts actually that I read that commercial saw units were buying that chain, and they said it was no good. The Brazilian made chain, and who knows, that maybe that one 3/8 low profile I got is either that or Chinese, but I guess I'll have to get robbed and go to the steel dealer and get the RS chain. So anyway, there's my take. And let me know what you think about bars and chain, and we'll see you on the next exciting video.